Good morning, church. It is a privilege to be with you this morning. My family has a long history with this church. My dad, Charles Seibert, consulted more than once with this leadership and had a great relationship with many of you. And he died 3 years ago yesterday, but his work lives on in many of us, and it's a privilege to get to do these kind of preaching engagements because I feel real close to him because he did this a lot. He used to call me on Sundays from DFW Airport, from wherever he had preached or consulted that weekend. So this is a kind of a good emotional experience for me today. This church also has a long history with City Square, which used to be Central Dallas Ministries. Many of you know Larry James very well, and Larry's still around, but he brought me in a few years ago to be his succession plan, and so that's kind of unfolded to where now I'm president and chief operating officer of City Square, and he's still CEO, but he doesn't have to worry about day-to-day decisions. So I get to lose all the sleep, and he gets to have all the fun, and it's a win-win. But don't worry, before I went to City Square in August of 2012, I preached for 10 years in Richardson, so I have done this before, don't worry. While many of you may know about City Square, you might not know how much we've grown over the past few years, so let me give you a status report just on the nature of our work. We currently have an annual budget that's exceeded $15 million a year now. We have developed over 1,400 units of housing in Dallas, 500 of which house people that were formerly homeless. We have about 105 folks in this neighborhood at Royal and Skillman and some apartments there. So we continue to do a lot in housing. We continue to do a lot in hunger relief. We serve over 25,000 people a year through our food pantry. We're the largest nonprofit provider of summer meals in the state of Texas. We help kiddos that qualify for free and reduced lunch during the school year access that food during the summer. There's a traditional model where you drop and go at places like the YMCA and Boys and Girls Clubs, and we do some of that. But we also have an innovative partnership with PepsiCo Frito-Lay and with our AmeriCorps teams where we go into apartment complexes where kids live. We actually have routes here in Lake Highlands that I've walked with Jerry Allen, the former city councilman, and he would say, John, every one of these kids, they're future Wildcats right here, Lake Highlands Wildcats. We do that all over Lake Highlands, Dallas, and the state of Texas. We take food to the kids. We have a big AmeriCorps program, which is the domestic version of the Peace Corps. We have about 80 year-round AmeriCorps members. We'll have over 250 AmeriCorps members in the summer. Many of them man these routes, and they go out, they convene the kids, they feed them, and then they play games with them, do kind of a day camp with them. Some churches even volunteer on those routes and turn it into kind of a VBS time in the apartment complex where these kids live. We do that in Dallas, Austin, Waco. We've done it in Houston, San Antonio. We've even done it in Denver, Colorado, where we've launched another City Square Denver as a satellite. So we're doing a lot in hunger relief. We have a big opportunity center that we built at I-30 and Malcolm X. It's a 53,000 square foot facility that houses a number of our programs. All of our workforce training programs are housed there, as well as our food pantry. We have a big commercial kitchen, and we're getting ready to launch a culinary workforce training program there. We have a cafe space there where we'll actually have a cafe in which our students can work. We'll be able to serve food on the campus. In addition to all of our employment training programs, we have a financial coaching center there where we help low-income folks that have employment. We help them get employment, and then once they have employment, we help them try to build assets. 20% of Dallas County lives at or below the poverty line. There's another 20% above that lives in asset poverty, which means if they lost their jobs tomorrow, they couldn't live, they wouldn't have 90 days to live on. They have trouble achieving home ownership. They have trouble achieving automobile ownership. Many are not banked. Many don't make enough income. Their wages are just too low. They can't build assets. But we're trying to work with them to increase training, thus increasing wages. We're trying to work with them to get banked. We're trying to help them avoid payday lenders and loan sharks and a whole financial industry that preys on the poor, and get them into financial services that will actually have their back. We're doing a lot of that kind of financial coaching. The Workforce Commission has a site on campus with us. So when folks need to go to the Employment Commission, they're coming on our campus, and they can be referred into our employment programs or vice versa. We also have a partner there called Perscolas that does free IT training. They help folks get their certifications, A+ and CompTIA, get entry-level jobs into IT fields. The first graduating class at Perscolas, their average salary was $38,000 a year. So we're excited to have them on campus. We have LIFT, which is Literacy Instruction for Texas. So if folks need to get a GED in order to get on a career path, we can do that right on campus. Literacy help, that kind of stuff. We have case management throughout our organization, what we call neighbor support services, where we help our neighbors where they are, kind of remove barriers to self-sufficiency and try to achieve their goals. We have a thrift store down by Baylor Hospital downtown that's a social enterprise for us. We take your stuff and turn it into cash that we can use for our work. We also use it to outfit the apartments for many of our neighbors, to help neighbors get clothing, small wares, whatever they need. We have a law firm that's a public interest law firm. We take over about 300 cases a year, mainly family law, a lot of custody, child support, protective orders, helping mamas and kiddos primarily. We have a medical clinic. It's a partnership with Baylor Healthcare System. It's not just a charity clinic where you get the excess of a doctor's time on a Thursday night. It's actually a fully functioning medical home within the Health Texas system. So if you go to a Health Texas doctor, there's a good chance our clinic scores better than yours in adult preventative services. We're the highest rated clinic in the Baylor system other than the concierge practices for adult preventative services. So it's really high level of health care. Access to health care is a huge problem in this city and in this state. And if we can create a medical home for folks that are uninsured or underinsured, that's a huge barrier to overcome in the fight against poverty. So as you can tell, we are fighting poverty on all fronts in many different ways. We're excited to have a partnership with Abilene Christian University, where we have a big building downtown, a 15-story building, 511 Ackerd, that we renovated. We turned it into 200 units of affordable housing. We also put our headquarters there. And then on the second floor of that building, Abilene Christian University has a campus there. So we're able to integrate ACU students into our work. They get to start changing the world even before they have their diploma. And they get to bring their discipline to bear on our work. So if it's accounting and finance, social work, ministry, education, you name it, they can use those disciplines in the fight against poverty and in building community. So we're really blessed to have that partnership. As you can tell, we're doing a lot of work. And I didn't even tell you about TRAC, which is our Transition Resource Action Center. It's like a mini city square for youth aging out of foster care. We get all the youth that age out in this region, Region 3 of the state foster care system, and we help them transition to adulthood. So we're working with about 800 youth a year as they age out. You either have a 20-year-old or you've been one, and you know, even if you're well-adjusted and have a good family situation, your wheels can blow off a few times in your 20s. Well, imagine if you've averaged about 10 to 12 foster placements in your life, and instability is the only thing you know. That's a very vulnerable population, and so we're blessed to try to help them and guide them and give them a support system to help them move towards adulthood. We're doing a lot of work in community development, a lot of work in the fight against poverty. And oftentimes people ask us kind of, well, as a faith-based nonprofit, what does that look like? Are you a church? And we say, no, we're not very churchy, but we're very kingdom. We're a Matthew 25 type group. You know, when Jesus is asked, okay, Jesus, we're all competitive. We like to keep score. We need to know who's winning, who's on the right team. When this thing's all said and done, how will we know who was on your team, Jesus? And Jesus says, well, who went and visited prisoners in prison? Who fed the hungry? Who housed the homeless? Who cared for the sick? Whoever was taking care of people in need, whoever was with the outsider, whoever went to the fringes, those people, they're on my team, Jesus says. So we try to say, look, we're on Jesus' team. We're trying to do the work that Matthew 25 called us to do. The other lens that we use to describe our work is John chapter 1. The notion of the Word becoming flesh and moving into the neighborhood. And that's the image I want to really reflect on today. If any of you are sci-fi fans, then John's gospel is the gospel for you. It kind of begins in a galaxy far, far away. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And there's this existent divine Word, even before there's the earth. In the beginning is this word, and through this word, all things are created. From outside of creation, the word brings about creation. And then, like the Superman movie, the word kind of barrels through space and lands on earth. This creative word becomes flesh and dwells among us, John says. If you translate that in Greek, it literally means moves into the neighborhood, comes near to us. The word becomes flesh and moves into the neighborhood so that we might see the glory of God's only Son, full of grace and truth. Jesus becomes flesh and enters into creation so we might see what the love of God looks like. And this is a really important point because it's counter to a lot of what we've learned about the nature of God and the nature of religion. You see, after Jesus, there will come a time when the Greeks, when Greco-Roman philosophers are the greatest thinkers on the earth. People like Plato. And a guy like Plato is going to say, you know, material things, flesh and blood things, that's certainly not the real world. The real world is spiritual. There's this spiritual realm above the material. And what's really real is spiritual. And this material stuff isn't real. And that leads to a notion and kind of an obsession within Christianity about heaven. So many of us grew up in churches that talked a lot more about heaven than they talked about earth, didn't they? And perhaps you've been asked the question, where would you go today if you died? The gospel of Jesus was fire insurance for many, wasn't it? Well, I don't want to go to hell, so sign me up. Where do I go? Well, we got a pool over here. Come on over. Because the real world's heaven, and where are you going to go when you want to die? The Jews, the Hebrews, Jesus and his contemporaries didn't talk about life in God that way. They didn't go around asking people, where would you go if you died tomorrow? They didn't go around acting like the spiritual realm was the real realm. No, Jesus entered into creation, into the material, and said, this world is really important. I can just imagine him going around singing, this is my Father's world. It really is. And it is good, God said. And so that's an important thing to understand, that the ministry of Jesus has a very this worldly component to it. Jesus cares very much about material things. And this is not some holding cell until we die and go to the real world. This is the real world. And in fact, Revelation kind of gives us this notion that when Jesus comes and wins the war once and for all, there will not just be a new heaven, but there will also be a new earth. And even the announcement at the end of Revelation is, God's place is among mortals. That the fulfillment of creation, the reconciliation of all things, the restoration that God is after a restoration movement. It's the restoring of all creation. And that in the end times, that's what we will see, is God in community, in fellowship with God's creation. And there will be a new creation. So that's why John's gospel sounds a whole lot like the book of Genesis. Remember the book of Genesis? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning, God creates the fish and the animals, and God creates the seas and the skies, and God creates all material things and says, boy, I blew that. What a mess. No, God says, this is good stuff. Especially when God creates humans, males and females in God's image. And then, boy, God's like, now I can take a vacation. This is awesome. I'm going to take a day of rest. Creation is good. Well, John's gospel picks up that notion that the God who created is now the God who in Jesus Christ will recreate. The God who will make creation new. And so what we see in John's gospel is this work of new creation. This work of restoring the material world. And so in John's gospel, Jesus doesn't do miracles. He does miraculous things, but they're never called miracles. They're called signs. They're pointing to this deeper truth of the nature of Jesus. And at the very end of John's gospel, John will say, I've shared these things with you so that you might believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and so you might have life in his name. John's gospel is the how to get a life gospel. If you need to get a life, this is how. If you want to really live, watch how Jesus lives. Watch how Jesus loves. Watch how Jesus serves. Watch how Jesus communes. Watch the relationships and the community and the self-sacrifice. The Word becomes flesh and moves into the neighborhood so we might experience the love of God. And in seeing God's love lived out in Jesus, we might get a life too. And we might become people who truly know how to live and how to love. There's a real nerdy word for this that theologians use called the incarnation. God becoming flesh is called the incarnation. And an early church father named Athanasius wrote a piece called On the Incarnation, where he said, Christ became human so we humans might know how to become divine. Jesus showed us what the image of God looks like in the flesh, so we who were created as images of God might live up to our birthright. So we might be who we really are. So we might get a life. At City Square, we're just trying to get a life. We're trying to help our neighbors do that too. And our hope is when we move into a neighborhood that our neighbors will see the love of God in us, full of grace and truth. And honestly, we don't believe that mission, that calling is any different than yours. That's the mission for all of us as followers of Christ, isn't it? Isn't that the mission for every one of us that's a person of God? Isn't that really the mission of the church? To put flesh and blood, skin and bones on the love of God and allow people to experience it in this world, in these communities, in flesh and blood ways, here and now. But somehow many of our communities have gotten confused about that mission and that calling. And too often we've turned inward and we no longer view the welfare of the community as our primary focus and mission because we're too concerned about the welfare and the future of the church. And countless hours, unending energy is spent on how do we help the church survive? How do we maintain the church? And if we're not careful, what happens is the church as gathered people overtakes God's vision of the church as sent people, doesn't it? And church as neighborhood overtakes God's vision of church as neighborhood, as neighbor. We create our own alternative neighborhood instead of going out to be neighbor. The church as institution replaces God's vision of the church as incarnation. And when that happens, it becomes really difficult for people to experience the love of God full of grace and truth where they live. And it becomes hard for churches to develop disciples who understand what it means to move into neighborhoods and be a neighbor. because all the rhythms and processes and forms they've been exposed to are about institution instead of incarnation. Recently, I saw this contrast in a decision that was made in Collin County. There's a biker bar up there called Hogs and Dogs. And they don't sell enough food to offset the amount of alcohol they sell. And so they're in jeopardy of losing their license. And there was a hearing where a city in McKinney was trying to shut them down and put them out of business. And it looked like an open and shut case until a minister from a local Methodist church at the council meeting stood up and said, "I beg you to give our friends at Hogs and Dogs an extension, because they've got more authentic incarnational community going on there than we have at our church. And if you shut them down, a sacred space where people are known and know others will be wiped out of our community. It will be a huge blow to community development if you shut down the biker bar." Not usually what you expect a preacher to stand up and say about the biker bar, is it? But what he understood is it has encapsulated the incarnation of God in ways that his church has lost. And so he and some others have made their ministry to go in and eat hot dogs at lunch, trying to get the amount of food, their food ratio up. Here's the thing about incarnational community. It doesn't require any programs, any effort to draw people to it. It naturally inspires our children. It's inherently contagious. It's so hospitable, it just makes room for more and more and more. It's naturally all the things we spend times in meetings trying to figure out programs to make the church. Incarnational ministry is not a program. It's a posture. It's an attitude. It's a way of life. It's a way of life embodied by Jesus in the Gospel of John, which is why I'm so thankful that the Jesus of John's Gospel can develop in us instincts that will help us get a life and show others how to live too. And will help us change the scorecard of what it means to be faithful to the ministry of Jesus. Oftentimes the scorecard that churches have is, how many people were at church on Sunday? How many people are in our programs? How much money did we raise? And if we're going to build something, usually it's limited to building facilities for those church programs. But what if our vision were to lead us beyond the institution of the church? What if we were to think of our ministry as the people of God incarnationally, and think of it in terms of how can we, like Jesus Christ, move out into the neighborhood so that our neighbors might experience the love of God, full of grace and truth. Imagine how the scorecard might change if a church said, we're going to measure our effectiveness by the number of kids in the local schools that are hungry. And if that number doesn't go down, we haven't been faithful to our calling. We want to know how many people in our zip code have access to health care. And we're going to make it our shared mission and ministry to make sure the number of people that have access to health care will go up. You know, that used to be kind of how the church functioned. That's why our hospitals have names on them like Presbyterian and Methodist and Baylor. Because when communities would have epidemics of illness and disease, guess who it was that went into the sick places and cared for the sick? Followers of Christ. There's a story in ancient church history about a plague that almost wiped out civilization. And that plague became one of the biggest church growth experiences the church has ever had. Because the followers of Christ were so nurturing of one another, they cared for each other so well, they suffered together so faithfully that they survived the plague at 3 or 4 times the rate of non-believers. And then these crazy Christians, at a time when people would put their own relatives out to die if they got sick and say, "You're not getting any of that plague on me," Christians would go into the community where the plague was, where the sick were, even if they weren't family, even if they weren't believers, and they put their own health at risk to care for the community. And when a community went through a plague and saw the love of Jesus in flesh and blood ways through Christians that cared for them, let's just say the church needed a bigger building. Because people experienced the love of God full of grace and truth. Because followers of Christ chose to go out and be neighbors instead of huddle up as a neighborhood. Isn't that amazing? Imagine what can happen if so many gifted Christian folks like you and like me make that our mission. Can you imagine the story in the Dallas Morning News? All these indicators of poverty are all headed in the right direction, and we're trying to figure out what's going on up there in Lake Highlands. Is it just gentrification? No, there's this crazy group of Christians over there off 635 that changed the scorecard and decided to go out and be a neighbor. What you'll find is the folks in this neighborhood are neighbors you'll love to have. That's one of the things we've learned at City Square is that we're not the rich ones that care for the poor. Everybody's rich and everybody's poor, just in different ways. And that's why we have a community where we nurture one another. I'm so thankful for the posture of this church and for this series you're launching into, because I think it will lead to creative expressions in this neighborhood as you will boldly re-envision how to be a neighbor. And I think there will be stories like the one Anne Lamott tells. Anne Lamott is a Christian writer. She's kind of a contemporary bad girl of the Bible. She's a character. About 29 years ago, she became sober. After dealing with drugs and alcohol and an eating disorder. And at the time she was at rock bottom, she found herself wooed into the life of a church. She would walk by and hear the music. And there was this emptiness in her that just longed to be filled. And so she would kind of stagger in, often hungover, into a church. And when this drunk lady came in, nobody called security. Nobody ushered her out. They welcomed her in. And they loved her as she was. And they loved her as she began to get sober. And then when she got pregnant out of wedlock, they didn't banish her with a scarlet letter. They didn't disqualify her from membership. They loved her baby as their own. And said, no one will call this child a bastard child. This is a child of God. And she said, despite all this hospitality, I would wrestle with whether or not I could believe in Jesus. And she said, one day, I had decided it was just too crazy to believe in Jesus Christ. She said it was about that time I get a knock on my door. It's a 50-something-year-old white guy named Gordon. Gordon's married to Margaret, one of the ministers at the church. And he says, Ann, Margaret and I want to do something for you and for the baby. And so here's what I want you to do. I want you to pretend that a little fairy has come to you and that you can tell the fairy whatever horrible thing you wish could be done around your house that you're too tired to do and too embarrassed to ask somebody else to help you with. She said, oh, Gordon, I can't do that. He said, you're not talking to me. Talk to the fairy. And she tells the fairy, my bathroom is gross. My toilet and my tub need to be cleaned, and I'm too tired to do it. But I hate going in there. For the next 2.5 hours, this 50-year-old white dude is on his hands and knees, cleaning the tub and the toilet and the sink, while a young mother lays on the couch, nursing her child to sleep and resting. And she said, I felt guilty at first, but then more than anything, I just felt sure. I felt sure again about the love of God and that I could believe in Jesus. She said, because to me, the Word became flesh and moved into my neighborhood. I've seen the love of God full of grace and truth. He was on his hands and knees in my bathroom, cleaning my toilet. May we be the toilet cleaners in this neighborhood. May we go out, be sent to put flesh and blood and skin and bone on the love of God. So that for our neighbors in this community, it won't be hypothetical or theoretical. It will be actual, material, flesh and blood. And they'll say, oh, I know Jesus. He cleaned my bathroom yesterday.